Hey everybody, this is John from MTGO Nexus coming at you with another deck guide overview. This time, Modern Infect, formerly a staple of the format, now has been relegated to the margins, much like decks like Dredge, Jund, Tron. Used to be a staple of the format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. So Infect is a version of a deck that takes advantage of the Infect mechanic, which whenever it deals combat damage to a player, deals damage in poison counters, and whenever it deals damage in combat to a creature, it deals them -1/-1 counters rather than traditional normal damage. Your opponent loses the game should they happen to hit 10 poison counters or more. And this mechanic might become more relevant with the introduction of Toxic with the new Phyrexian set coming out soon. All will be one, but remains to be seen if this archetype will get much in the way of new cards. There are a couple different variants of the deck. Most of them do tend to be green-based, as the decks tend to function around the Infect creatures and pump spells, and most good pump spells in Magic's history tend to be of the green variety. This deck starts out with Glistener Elf as a 1/1 in generic Infect creature, and then obviously you have Blighted Agent, which is 1 in a red for a 1/1 unblockable creature, which takes away one of the avenues with which you can deal with your opponent's Infect creatures. Then finally you have Inkmoth Nexus, which is a 1/1 man land that has flying and deals damage in Infect. Beyond that, your deck is full of pump spells and different ways to protect your creatures. Noble Hierarch is a mana dork that has the Exalted mechanic, which allows you to attack with your creatures and give it +1/+1 if it attacks alone. Very good when you're swinging with a Blighted Agent or an Inkmoth Nexus. And then various different pump spells, starting with one of the newer ones to the deck, Scale Up, which until end of turn, target creature control becomes a green worm with base power and toughness 6/4. Basically turns your Infector into a 6 Infect creature, and usually one other 4-mid damage pump spell will get you there. To that end, you have Might of Olakrosa, which gets +2/+2, and then if you happen to cast it during main phase, the creature gets +4/+4. Groundswell, something very similar, only this is a landfall trigger, gives it +4/+4 instead of +2/+2. And then Mutagenic Growth is a Phyrexian spell that gives it +2/+2, and you can pay it for 2 life or 1 green mana. Blossoming Defense and gives it Hexproof and +2/+2. Vines of the Vastwood gives the creature Hexproof. I believe it's Hexproof. Creature can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponent's control. And then gets +4/+4 if it was kicked for 1 and a green. So basically for 2 green mana it gets +4/+4, and your opponent cannot target it. And then you have Distortion Strike, which makes your creature unblockable with Rebound. Spell Pierce as another thing to protect against removal spells. And then Apostle's Blessing as a way to protect your creature from a color of your choice or from artifacts. Spellskite as a way to redirect removal spells to Spellskite instead of your Infect creatures. Then Become Immense as a way to take advantage of all these cards you're putting into your graveyard, allowing you to potentially one-shot your opponent out of nowhere with 1 green mana and a bunch of cards in your graveyard. Beyond that, you play a 1 of Pendelhaven to allow you to pump your creature that tiny little bit more. Waterlogged Grove as a way to recoup some cards whenever you're flooding out a little bit. And that is pretty much the main deck, what it's trying to accomplish in the Simic variant. The sideboard's kind of all over the place. You have 4 copies of Invisible Stalker, which is hexproof, so you don't have to protect it quite as hard, and it can't be blocked. Takes advantage of all your pump spells. It does have the downside of obviously you have to deal 20 conventional damage, but in Modern sometimes that's a little bit easier with all the fetch lands and shock lands, especially when people might be a little bit more liberal with their life total playing against an Infect deck, not thinking they're in danger of dying to regular damage. Then you have various different things. Ceremonious Rejection, very good against anything like Karn or Tron. So any type of artifact you might expect out of your opponent, whether it be something like Hammer Time, decks like Tron, etc. Mystical Dispute when you're fighting against other blue counterspell decks. Spell Pierce as another way to protect your creatures against early removal, things like Fatal Push and such. Shaper's Sanctuary as a 1 of, a nice one to kind of recoup some of the card advantage of your opponent playing removal spells. Force of Vigor, obviously very good against any type of artifact-based decks, so most of your Urza Saga decks, etc., Hammer Time, etc. Veil of Summer as a one of, looks like whoever did this deck list had very much just wanted their opponent to have to play around as many different effects as possible. Veil of Summer, good against discard, good against removal spells and counter spells, although counter spells do tend to struggle against this deck due to its sheer mana efficiency. Descender's Deliverance, way to blow up artifacts, also has cycling. Weather the Storm, primarily here for a deck like Burn. Wild Defiance is an interesting one, makes it impossible for things like Burn to kill your creatures, and also punctures things, so anything red-based removal, even Unholy Heat sometimes can easily be outpaced by this. Viridian Corruptor comes in, blows up an artifact, also happens to have Infect, so definitely opponent-like to have a bunch of one-ofs in their sideboard, and makes sense in some regards, but you probably would want to clean this up a little bit if you were going to play this deck a little bit more frequently, but, you know, it is nice to have a bunch of one-ofs and force your opponent to respect a bunch of different things game to game. The other type of Infect deck that has been running around for some time is Golgari Infect. Now this is a version that is still using the green base, but is using the black based things. Primarily what this adds is, unlike having to hold up counter spells, this deck can use something like Thoughtseize to clear the way, and then gets to play a card like Plague Stringer, which, while not as good as Blighted Agent, is still pretty decent. Flying is not always the easiest mechanic to deal with, as there aren't a ton of playable flyer creatures in Constructed. But the real prize of this is Phyrexian Crusader. Now, Phyrexian Crusader is a 2/2 first striking infector. The big thing with it is protection from red and protection from white. So black used to be the go-to removal spell in the format, but now with the printing of Unholy Heat, with the printing of Solitude, with the printing of Fury, really red and white have kind of taken over as the most efficient removal spells. Obviously, there's still things like Fatal Push in the format. There's still things like Assassin's Trophy or Abrupt Decay, those different things. But really, the vast majority of the most played removal are things like Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt, Solitude, Prismatic Ending, March of the Worldly Light, etc. You just have all these like efficient, powerful, free removal spells or cheap removal spells, and Phyrexian Crusader just flat out ignores all that. It ignores Solitudes, it ignores Furies, it can attack through an Omnath. It makes it laughs at a deck like Burn. That was a little bit slow in that matchup, but, it basically ignores a good chunk of the format's removal spells. And that is really the advantage of playing the Golgari version over the Simic version. Another interesting creature in this one is Gemraiser. I'm not entirely sure how the mutate mechanic works with Infect, but I know this allows you to blow up artifacts or enchantments. Also potentially turns your Infector into a 4/4. Pretty solid thing overall. I don't know how it plays in theory, as I really haven't seen a ton of Infect really be played in quite some time. But it is a card that you need to be aware of in this deck, and does give the deck a little bit of utility that's lacking with some of the blue spells gone. In place of Noble Hierarch, this version plays Ignoble Hierarch, giving you the same Exalted thing, one of its few additions for Modern Horizons 2. And then, obviously, Scale Up is a nice card. Then you get to play things like Blinded to the Vastwood, Snake Veil, +1/+1 counter target creature against Hexproof until end of turn. They're playing that in place of the Blossoming Defense that we saw in the other variant. And then, you're still playing Glistener Elf, Plague Stinger, Phyrexian Crusader. You get to play 4 copies of Inkmoth Nexus. Obviously, your mana is a little bit more stretched in this version, as you're playing a double black spell as opposed to just a single blue with something like Blighted Agent. But this version tries to execute very much the same strategy. Try to get your opponent, clear the way for them to kill them, but a little bit easier with a card like Phyrexian Crusader, especially if you go like turn 1 Ignoble Hierarch, turn 2 Phyrexian Crusader. Your opponent's under the gun and may not have a ton of ways to answer it. Sideboard, you have access to things like Thoughtseize to pair with the ones in the main deck to help clear the way. This version gets to play Choke against the blue decks, quite nice. Force of Vigor, very good against the Hammer Time decks and various Urza Saga decks. Veil of Summer, good way to protect your creatures from removal, as well as protect yourself from discard spells and counter spells. Nature's Claim, very good against anything that you need to blow up, primarily out of either Tron or the Urza Saga decks. And Endurance, when you need to slow down graveyard-based decks, as something like Living End could be kind of a nightmare-ish matchup. And then finally, I want to Weather the Storm. I'm starting to sense a thing that Burn may not be a good matchup for Infect overall. Finally, if you're not happy playing Simic or Golgari, you can just shove them all together into a Sultai build. This version obviously gets to play both Blighted Agent and Phyrexian Crusader. You have your Spell Pierces and stuff to help protect your things. Otherwise, you're playing a bunch of the same cards. This version, you can either play Ignoble Hierarch or gets to play both Ignoble Hierarch and Noble Hierarch. Helps the mana a little bit, but man, that's a lot of mana dorks, especially in a format that answers them so efficiently anymore. But, you know, you still get to have these Noble Hierarchs, Ignoble Hierarchs pumping your team, and you get to play the two best Infect creatures in the format besides Inkmoth Nexus. And obviously, you still have a good number of pump spells, Blossoming Defense, Mutagenic Growth, Might of Old Krosa, and Scale Up in some numbers, as well as Vines of the Vastwood. So, tons of ways to protect your creatures. Get to play the two best Infect creatures slammed in one deck. Downside, your mana is going to be a bit of a mess. You have to be able to cast a double black spell. How many black sources does this deck even run? Runs 2 Overgrown Tombs and 1 Zaya Torres Proving Ground. I don't... Swamp Mountain Forest. I don't know why you wouldn't run the Sultai land instead. That doesn't make much sense to me that you would need a mountain in this deck. I think you'd run the Sultai Tri-land instead to facilitate your mana. But beyond that, you still get to run the one of Pendelhaven, still get to run the Inkmoth Nexuses, you get to run a copy of Beseju, and you still get to run don't get to run the Pain lands in this version, or the Canopy lands, because your mana base is a little bit more stretched. But, you know, you still get to play all these very powerful Infect creatures. Sideboard, Surgical Extractions for graveyard nonsense along with Endurances. Whoever was playing this deck really didn't like losing to things like Living End and Dredge. Thoughtseize to help clear the way a little bit. Dismember as a removal spell for problematic creatures. Leyline the Void, once again, somebody really doesn't like losing to graveyard decks. Force of Vigor for any type of Hammer Time shenanigans or any type of Blood Moon, as that can be relevant against this particular version especially. Then Pithing Needle, shut down problematic Planeswalkers or permanents. So, what does Infect do that the rest of the format doesn't do? Infect was basically Hammer Time before Hammer Time. It was a deck that could threaten to kill you out of nowhere on turn 2 or turn 3, and could still play this kind of like tricky, different ways to protect my creatures, kind of tempo-ish game where, you know, they didn't have to go all in, but they could threaten you at any time to kill you. Why this has obviously faded in the background: Unholy Hate, Solitude, Fury. You know, as more and more efficient removal and powerful removal is printed in the format, the big advantage that Infect got of being this cheap, low to the ground, aggressive deck, you know, it's really kind of overwhelmed you. And then, you know, things like Hammer Time have kind of popped up, which basically does what this deck does, but without having to play a bunch of pump spells. You know, yes, it plays Colossus Hammer, but Colossus Hammer fits in the strategy of Stoneforge Mystic and Pure Steel Paladin and Sigarda's Aid, whereas this version of the deck can just be like, oh, my 1 or 2 creatures got killed or Thoughtseize, and all of a sudden I have all these pump spells in my hand and can't do anything. You know, sure, you can try to win with like Noble Hierarch or Noble Hierarch Beatdown, but if you don't have an Infect creature, this deck gets pretty rough, whereas, you know, Hammer Time has access to Urza's Saga and all these other different tools. So it just comes down to a game of really the format has gotten grindier and the removal spells more efficient, and much like so many other tribal decks, unless it finds ways to adapt, just not quite there in terms of the expected power level of the format anymore. Now, is it still a deck that can win you games, and can people get caught off guard by it? Yeah. And the other power that Infect used to have is this was one of those decks that could threaten to race a Belcher or an Upsal Spells or a Neo Brand. You know, this is one of those few decks that could just legitimately kill you on turn 2 or turn 3 and not have to have these like haphazard, like all-in combo things. This is a deck that could just go like turn 1 Glistener Elf, turn 2 Tenya, and you're dead, and not having to mulligan to, you know, your Allosaurus Rider plus Neoform plus needing the mana plus this plus that, but, you know, or, you know, 4 mana plus your Balustrade Spy. This is a deck that could threaten to keep up with those decks without, you know, folding to as much in the way of needing to mulligan. Basically, if it has an infect creature and some ways to cast it and protect it, you're good. That said, you know, like I said, this deck is a little bit falling behind the format. You know, much like decks like Dredge, much like decks like Tron, it can show up, it can do well, especially to local FNM or something. But as far as bigger decks, there are decks that simply do what this deck does better now, in the form of specifically Hammer Time. But as always, this is a deck you might like to pilot at some point, could certainly throw some people off guard. And this is Modern Infect of the Simic, Sultai, and Golgari varieties.